So far better or worse, Palworld is here, and I've had a little play around with it and it's pretty wild. As a D&D player at heart, I'm definitely more of a fan of the turn-based combat that was popular in the copyright protected inspiration for this game, but there are some interesting, if maybe unoriginal creature designs in Palworld. As a bit of an experiment, I thought we could just jump on that hype train and have a bit of fun by transforming some of the pals from Palworld into Dungeons & Dragons monsters, and homebrew up some stat blocks for them. Let's see what we can do. Hi everyone, I'm Nazir North and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm going to take 3 pals from Palworld, ones you'll probably recognise from the beginning of the game. We're going to look at their skills and abilities and then rebuild them from the ground up as monsters for D&D 5th edition. But before we jump in, I also wanted to let you all know that I'm going to open up my inbox to your monster drawings and sketches. This is where you guys can send in your monster drawings and I will choose my favourite ones and make a video on creating some homebrew stat blocks for them for D&D 5e. Now, you don't have to be a professional artist, it can even just be a little doodle you did when you were bored at work. Just send something original, something that is yours, your own content, no sending in other people's artwork. Anyway, if you want to get involved, you can send your pictures to the email address on screen now, which is nnviewersubmissions@gmail.com. Alright, back to Palworld. The first pal we're going to look at is probably one of the first ones you see when you start up the game. It is this guy, Lamball, essentially just a ball of wool with a face. It has 2 notable abilities. The first, which I was going to jokingly call a roly-poly attack on my stat block, and then after I looked it up I realised it is actually called roly-poly in the game, which is just ridiculous. So you can see Lamball performing that attack here. Note though how after it does the roly-poly attack, the Lamball actually gets dizzy and needs a moment to recover, so we'll need to factor that into the homebrew. The second ability Lamball has is where the presumably human protagonist in the game can use Lamball as a meat shield. It doesn't seem very happy about that though. I haven't actually had the heart to test this ability out in combat yet. I mean, come on, look at it. How could you? But anyway, this is called Fluffy Shield and essentially lets you pick up the Lamball and use it as a shield, as the name implies. Okay, let's go through the stat block I've made. First point of clarity before we jump in, I know pals unlock different moves and abilities as they level up, but I'm just going to focus on their base level 1 abilities for this exercise. I don't want the stat blocks to get overloaded. Maybe we'll come back to these pals in a future video to examine some of their higher level abilities once I've had a chance to play the game some more and actually unlock those higher level abilities, but let's just stick to level 1 for now. Okay, on with the stat block. I've given Lamball the beast type. Although I think most pals will probably fit better as monstrosities and maybe some elementals. In 5th edition D&D, the main distinction between monstrosities and beasts is that beasts in D&D tend to not have any kind of supernatural or magical abilities, while monstrosities often do. If you want a point of reference in the monster manual, I would say look at something like the wolf versus the winter wolf. The wolf is a basic animal, like a real-life wolf, and is therefore a beast. The winter wolf, however, has some magical cold-based abilities, including a breath weapon. Therefore, it is a monstrosity. The monstrosity type in D&D is also used for things that come from mythology, like the Minotaur or the Hydra, for example. And a lot of the pals, I think, are sort of inspired by fictional or mythological creatures as well. But none of that applies to poor little Lamball, at least with its level 1 abilities. It's basically just a sheep. It doesn't have any kind of magical or supernatural abilities, so beast it is. For alignment for the pals, I went back and forth on this a few times as I was sketching out some ideas here, but I've decided to leave the pals unaligned. As although they do have different behaviours and different levels of aggression in the wild, when the player takes control of them, they are essentially just weapons. They are just tools that can perform any kind of task. So we'll stick with unaligned. Moving down in the stat block, I've tried to keep its stats and ability scores consistent with its behaviour and approximate challenge rating in the game. Now, I was tempted to give pals low intelligence like most beasts and monstrosities in D&D, but pals are actually capable of some pretty complex tasks, including things like assembling firearms. So they're clearly a lot smarter than they look. Based on that, I'm going to go with a 7 intelligence, as that's what skeletons have in the monster manual, and they are capable of using things like siege equipment and doing relatively complex tasks when directed. Speaking of skeletons, if you want to check out the video I did on skeleton battle tactics along with kobolds and goblins, I'll pop that card up in the corner now on screen. When it comes to movement, I've also given the Lamball a rolling speed. And there is actually a precedent for this in the monster manual. The earth elemental, the Galabdur, has this exact same feature, so I didn't need to make that up from scratch. And as a piece of general advice when it comes to homebrewing, always look to see if there is an official monster that does what you're trying to recreate. It's always best to make that check before you go inventing your own thing. Not only does it give you a better chance of making a more balanced monster, it's also just quicker. It's going to save you time. When it comes to weaknesses, vulnerabilities and resistances, Lamball is a neutral element pal, which means they only have one weakness, and that is to the dark element. As we don't have dark damage in D&D, I think the effects of dark damage in the game reminds me most of either necrotic or maybe psychic damage, so I've gone with psychic damage for this. The Lamball then has 2 signature abilities. These are where it can roll into someone for some extra damage, just like the Galabdur can when it's rolling, although as we can see in this clip from the game, that does stun the Lamball for 1 round, whether it hits its target or not. And that is pretty debilitating in D&D, being locked out essentially for 1 entire round. But let's face it, we were never expecting the Lamball to be a strong monster. And for its other ability, it can also be picked up to be used as a damage sponge by a medium humanoid. When the humanoid does this, any attacks that would target them instead target the Lamball. It then has just a single action, which is a simple slam attack. And it's going to try and use this in conjunction with its roly-poly feature, and that's it, a nice simple stat block to start with. The next one we're going to look at is Foxparks. This guy is a little further into the game, down the first few hills after you start, but it's still in that beginning tutorial area. And it's probably going to be the first fire-themed pal that you'll spot in the game. Foxbox has some more interesting abilities than Lamball, including a ranged attack, and overall it's a little more combat focused as a pal. It has an ability called Ignis Blast, which is its preferred attack. It's a bit like the Firebolt cantrip from D&D, a sort of basic ranged fire attack. And then it also has this signature ability called Huggy Fire, which is where you pick the pal up and use them like a literal flamethrower. This game is just complete nonsense, but honestly I've quite enjoyed playing it so far. Anyway, let's have a look at how I've turned this into a stat block. Nothing special here with regards to the armor class, hit points, speed or ability scores. But when it comes to the elements in Palworld, fire element pals are resistant to ice and grass. Now ice is easy because we can just translate that into D&D as cold damage. Grass though is a little trickier, but the matchup I've gone with is poison. Now fire is weak to water, which also doesn't really have an equivalent in D&D. So what I've done instead is borrow the water susceptibility trait which your basic fire elementals have from the monster manual. Although I've removed the part in that ability about them taking damage when they move through water, as Foxparks seems to have no issue just going for a little swim in the game. For its Huggy Fire ability, we've borrowed some of the wording from Lamball in terms of it being picked up, but we also need to add a limit of uses to this. With Fluffy Shield, the limit of use is essentially when Lamball runs out of hit points, so for this one I think we just need a simple numerical limit, so I've just gone with once per day. And in terms of what this actually does, the humanoid who picks Foxparks up can just use its breath weapon with their action. And speaking of breath weapon, I've given it Fire Breath, and I've just borrowed this straight from the Winter Wolf from the monster manual and changed the cold damage to fire damage. Even though Foxbox doesn't technically get a breath weapon fire breath type ability in Palworld until around level 30, you can see him do this at the furnace or campfire right from level 1, so it seems a shame to leave that out. And even though this isn't in the game, I've given it a basic bite attack, as otherwise it doesn't have any melee options at all. Overall, it's got a bit more damage potential than Lamball, but it's still not a particularly tough foe by D&D standards. In fact, both of the ones we've looked at so far are probably better off as a pet or companion for the party than a monster to fight against. However, for this third and final homebrew for this video, we're going to go off the complete other end of the scale to create the biggest pal most of us will have seen in the early game, Mammorest. This absolute unit is a huge mammoth-like creature that has its own ecosystem growing on its back. Now, I know I said I was sticking to level 1 abilities for Lamball and Foxparks, but you probably aren't going to see Mammorest in the game at such a low level. In fact, the first one you see is around about level 30, so I'm going to include some of their higher level signature abilities into this build as well. Let's go straight into the stat block as there is a lot to cover on this one. I've gone with huge in size, although you could probably make the case for it being gargantuan. I didn't measure its exact size in game. And for type I've gone with elemental, as this reminds me most of the Zaratan from D&D, which is this sort of giant elemental turtle with plants growing off its back. I've given it an OK AC and a big pool of hit points. For ability scores, I've made it strong and tanky, but also upped its wisdom a bit as well, as elephants are fairly wise. As with the last two pals, we're going to follow that Palworld logic of elemental strengths and weaknesses. So Mammorest is a grass element, which is weak to fire and resistant to ground. Now, in D&D we don't have a ground type, but I've actually gone with thunder instead. Many of the ground attacks in Palworld are often concussive or shockwave based, like earthquake attacks, so I think thunder works quite well for this. And if you haven't spotted it already, this guy has a challenge rating of 17. This is a tough boss level monster that is no pushover. It has a lot of damage potential, which we will get to shortly. Mammorest's partner skill is nothing special, it just allows us to use Mammorest as a mount, and it improves your tree cutting and mining skills. So for this, I've just gone with a siege monster trait, which allows it to do extra damage to objects and structures. There are a few monsters in the monster manual that have this trait, including, for example, the Tarrasque. So again, we don't need to create anything, we can copy an existing ability without having to invent anything new. And apologies, I don't actually have any footage of me riding the Mammorest yet because I'm still too rubbish at this game to fight it and capture it. Okay, and back to the stat block. I've given the Mammorest a melee attack, as in the game it doesn't really seem to have much in the way of melee capabilities. As a big elephant, I've given it the charge feature and a gore action as an attack, copied from the Minotaur from the monster manual. It just seems to fit for a big stampeding animal with tusks. And also, as I've made the Mammorest into a legendary monster, I've given it some legendary resistances, 3 per day. On actions, I haven't included Sand Blast because it's a little bit boring as an ability and we already have the Seed Machine Gun as its go-to ranged attack. The Seed Machine Gun is a ranged weapon attack which does a little bit of piercing damage and a little bit of poison damage. As we discussed already, poison is sort of the closest thing we have to grass when it comes to D&D damage types. Then we also have, as I'd mentioned, the Gore attack as a melee option. I've given it multi-attack so it can attack twice with either of these options on each turn. Now on to the legendary actions. As it's a big creature, I've given it a trample action, which allows it to basically run over nearby foes, potentially doing a little bit of damage and knocking them prone. We then have one of its Palworld moves, Grass Tornado. This targets up to 2 creatures, does some bludgeoning damage and has a chance to knock them flying in a random direction. And finally, costing 3 legendary actions to use is Power Bomb, another Palworld ability. I've essentially modelled this after an upcast Fireball spell, but doing just straight force damage instead of fire damage. As in the description for this ability in Palworld, it has a bit of a wind up to use this. So I've ruled here that Mammorest can't use that legendary action 2 rounds in a row, representing a sort of recharge time for that ability. And there we have it, 3 Palworld Pals reimagined as monsters for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you want to get a hold of these stat blocks for use in your own campaigns, you can check out the links in the description to where I've posted these to Reddit. And if you like this concept of transforming creatures from other media into D&D monsters, let me know in the comments what else would you like to see, and what might you have done differently with the 3 we looked at in this video. This is just my subjective take on it. Let me know in the comments. I hope you've all enjoyed this one. If you have, remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. And if you want to watch some more monster breakdowns for D&D 5th edition, you can check out those cards on the end screen. Cheers everyone, I'll see you next time.